The story of trench warfare in the First World War begins not in the mud of the Western Front, but in the tense political landscape of early 20th century Europe. To understand why millions of men would soon find themselves living and dying in narrow ditches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss Alps, we have to step back to a time when the great powers of Europe were bound together in promises of support, yet divided by ambition, rivalry, and fear. Nations armed themselves with the newest industrial technologies, believing that strength alone could prevent war. But by the summer of 1914, this belief collapsed under the pressure of alliances and nationalist movements. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo triggered a chain reaction that pulled Europe into a conflict far larger and far more destructive than anyone had imagined. Within weeks, mobilization orders were issued from London to Berlin, from Paris to Vienna, and trains carried millions of soldiers toward what many believed would be a short, decisive war. Yet the war that unfolded did not resemble the rapid victories predicted by military planners. Instead, it became a long struggle defined by stalemate, attrition, and the brutal reality of trench warfare. The soldiers who marched off with confidence in August 1914 would soon discover that the industrial age had created weapons capable of killing on a scale unseen in history. Artillery, machine guns, barbed wire, and poison gas changed the very nature of battle. The traditional tactics of charging across open fields collapsed in the face of technologies that could wipe out entire units in minutes. These weapons forced armies to dig deep into the earth for protection, and the trenches became both shelter and prison, shaping every aspect of the war that followed. The first major clash on the Western Front began when German forces advanced rapidly through Belgium and into northern France, following the strategy known as the Schlieffen Plan. Their goal was to knock France out of the war before turning east to face Russia. Allied forces, mainly French and British, attempted to halt the German advance. The early battles were fast and bloody, but by September 1914, at the First Battle of the Marne, the German advance was stopped. Both sides began to dig defensive positions. What started as temporary foxholes quickly expanded into elaborate trench systems stretching hundreds of miles. The moment trenches were dug, the war changed forever. No longer would mobility and maneuver decide the outcome. Instead, firepower and fortification took center stage. As autumn turned to winter, soldiers on both sides discovered that life inside the trenches was far more dangerous and demanding than anything they had imagined. Trenches were not simply lines in the dirt, they became complex networks of front lines, support lines, communication trenches, and dugouts. Each was designed to protect soldiers from the constant threat of artillery fire and machine gun bursts. The trenches zigzagged deliberately to prevent enemies from firing down the length of them if they managed to break through. Sandbags, wooden planks, and corrugated iron were used to reinforce walls. Drainage ditches attempted to manage the relentless water that seeped into the earth. Yet even with careful design, nothing could truly make the trenches safe or comfortable. In those early months, armies believed the trench lines were temporary. They expected breakthroughs to come soon, restoring mobility to the battlefield. But the weapons of the industrial era made such breakthroughs nearly impossible. A defending force armed with machine guns could cut down attackers before they reached halfway across no man's land, the open space separating opposing trenches. Artillery bombardments, intended to weaken defenses, often tore up the ground so violently that advancing soldiers struggled to move through the cratered landscape. Even when attackers captured enemy trenches, they often lacked the reinforcements needed to hold them. The front lines solidified, and both sides settled into a war of endurance. Conditions deteriorated rapidly. Heavy rain turned the ground to mud. In some areas, water filled trenches up to a soldier's knees or even waist. The soil, churned by shells and constant movement, became a thick, clinging mess that made standing, walking, and even sleeping a challenge. Flooded trenches weakened walls, causing them to collapse without warning. Soldiers labored constantly to repair damage, often working under fire. The stench of mud mixed with the smell of smoke, rotting sandbags, and unwashed bodies. Rats multiplied by the thousands, feeding on leftover food scraps and, in the most disturbing cases, on the bodies of fallen soldiers left in no man's land. Lice infested clothing and bedding, causing relentless itching and spreading disease. Despite the hardships, the trenches became the defining feature of the Western Front. From late 1914 onward, soldiers learned to adapt to this new way of war. Daily routines developed, centered around maintaining weapons, strengthening defenses, and preparing for both expected and unexpected attacks. At dawn, soldiers stood to attention, ready for enemy raids, as this was a common time for assaults. Throughout the day, patrols moved through communication trenches, carrying messages, supplies, and sometimes wounded men. Artillery barrages erupted with little warning, showering trenches with shrapnel and dirt. Snipers watched for any movement above the parapet, forcing soldiers to crouch low or risk being killed instantly. In the early months, the shock of this new reality weighed heavily on soldiers' minds. Many wrote home describing the stark contrast between expectations of glory and the grim truth of trench life. They spoke of mud that swallowed boots, nights filled with fear, and the constant sound of artillery that never seemed to stop. Yet they also described moments of camaraderie, when shared suffering created strong bonds between men. Soldiers learned quickly that survival depended on discipline, teamwork, and the ability to endure conditions that tested both physical strength and mental resolve. By the end of 1914, it became clear that trench warfare was not a temporary phase. Both sides dug deeper, creating multi-layered defensive systems that made rapid breakthroughs even more difficult. Artillery grew heavier and more numerous. Machine gun positions multiplied. Barbed wire defenses thickened. A new era of warfare had begun, one in which territory was gained not by sweeping advances, but by inches, at enormous cost in human lives. This shift defined the next 4 years of conflict, shaping battles from Ypres to the Somme, from Verdun to Passchendaele, and leaving scars on Europe that would endure long after the guns fell silent. As winter settled over the front lines, soldiers struggled not only with enemy fire but also with the elements. Frostbite became common, especially in low-lying trenches where cold water pooled for days. Heavy coats and wool uniforms offered limited protection against freezing temperatures. When fires were lit, smoke could draw enemy attention. When fires were avoided, the cold became almost unbearable. Some soldiers developed a condition known as trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to wet, unsanitary conditions. If untreated, trench foot could lead to gangrene and even amputation. Medical teams worked constantly to manage such injuries, but the sheer number of cases overwhelmed them. At night, the battlefield transformed into a place of eerie quiet punctuated by sudden violence. Patrol groups crawled into no man's land seeking information about enemy positions. Listening posts were established to detect enemy tunneling operations, as both sides attempted to plant explosives beneath opposing trenches. Flares lit the sky, revealing silhouettes of soldiers scrambling for cover. Machine guns rattled, often triggered by the slightest movement. And over everything hung the constant risk of artillery, which did not cease simply because darkness had fallen. By early 1915, trench warfare had become entrenched in both a literal and strategic sense. Commanders struggled to find ways to break the stalemate. They experimented with new tactics, heavier bombardments, and innovations such as poison gas. But each attempt to return mobility to the battlefield came at a staggering human cost. The soldiers who lived in the trenches bore the weight of these efforts, enduring the dangers of repeated offensives and the crushing disappointment of seeing gains measured in yards rather than miles. This was the reality of the Western Front as 1915 began. The war had settled into a deadly rhythm, and trench warfare had become the defining experience of millions. As we move deeper into this story, we will explore the structure of the trenches, the weapons that made them necessary, the battles that shaped their evolution, and the daily existence of the soldiers who lived and died within their narrow walls. The trenches were more than just lines on a map, they were a world unto themselves, and understanding them is essential to understanding the First World War. To understand trench warfare, it is essential to visualize the complex systems that emerged along the Western Front. These were not simple ditches carved quickly into the earth. Over time, they evolved into intricate defensive networks designed to absorb the immense power of industrial weaponry. Each side built not one but several lines of trenches, creating depth rather than relying on a single barrier. The front line was where soldiers faced the immediate threat of enemy fire, but behind it lay support trenches, reserve trenches, and a web of communication pathways linking them all together. This layered approach made it difficult for attackers to fully overrun a defensive sector. Even if the front line fell, reinforcements could be brought forward from the rear, ensuring that no single breakthrough guaranteed success. A typical trench system included firing steps built into the walls so soldiers could look out over the parapet without exposing their entire body. The parapet itself was reinforced with sandbags and wooden planks, while the parados at the rear helped protect against shells bursting behind the trench. Duckboards lined the floor, intended to keep soldiers' feet out of the water and mud. In theory, this prevented trench foot and other infections. In practice, conditions often overwhelmed these preventative measures. Heavy rain, broken drainage systems, and constant shellfire turned many trench floors into deep, sticky mud despite the best efforts to maintain them. Communication trenches were essential. They twisted and turned toward the front lines, narrow enough to reduce exposure but wide enough for soldiers, stretcher bearers, and supply carriers to move through. At night, these trenches filled with men transporting ammunition, food, water, and equipment. Wounded soldiers were brought back along the same routes. Navigating these pathways was exhausting. In darkness, men stumbled over uneven ground, bumping into others as they carried heavy burdens. During artillery barrages, communication trenches became even more chaotic, as every man sought cover while still trying to accomplish his task. Behind these main lines were dugouts carved into the walls of trenches or deeper underground. These offered limited protection from shellfire and provided spaces for officers to hold meetings, for soldiers to rest, and for essential supplies to be stored. Some dugouts were simple shelters reinforced with timber. Others, especially on the German side, became more elaborate over time. German engineers, aware that they were fighting a defensive war on the Western Front, invested heavily in strong, well-built positions. Their dugouts could be several meters underground, complete with beds, lighting, and in some cases even heating. British and French dugouts were generally less comfortable, often built quickly and lacking the structural strength of their German counterparts. Nevertheless, any shelter was prized in a landscape where artillery dominated the battlefield. Above ground, barbed wire defenses formed a deadly barrier. Soldiers stretched coils of wire in front of their trenches to slow or halt enemy attacks. Artillery fire often tangled or buried this wire rather than destroying it, making it even more dangerous. Clearing barbed wire under fire was one of the most perilous tasks on the front. Soldiers equipped with wire cutters crawled into no man's land at night, trying to remain silent and unseen. A single misstep, a glint of moonlight on metal, or the rustling of wire could draw enemy fire. No man's land itself varied in width from a few dozen yards to more than a mile, depending on the sector. In some places, the opposing trenches were so close that soldiers could hear conversations on the other side. In others, the vast expanse of open ground created a psychological barrier as formidable as the physical dangers. No man's land was littered with shell craters, shattered trees, twisted wire, abandoned equipment, and the bodies of men who had fallen during assaults that failed to reach their objective. Venturing into this area during daylight was almost certain death. At night, it became a place of eerie tension where patrols crept silently between cratered earth and broken branches, listening for enemy movement. Daily life in the trenches revolved around a blend of routine and unpredictability. Soldiers were assigned rotations, spending days or weeks in the front line before being moved to support or reserve positions farther back. This rotation system was essential for preventing exhaustion, but even in rear areas, soldiers rarely enjoyed true rest. Training exercises, supply duties, and the constant movement of men and equipment meant that activity never stopped. Frontline service, however, consumed the most energy. Each day began before dawn with the ritual known as stand-to, when soldiers prepared for a possible enemy attack. Because dawn and dusk were considered favorable times for launching assaults, both sides expected potential action at these moments. Soldiers stood ready with rifles loaded, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. After stand-to, breakfast might be served if conditions allowed. Food supplies were inconsistent, but armies made great efforts to provide warm meals whenever possible. Stews, bread, tea, and sometimes meat were brought forward in insulated containers. Though the quality varied, hot food boosted morale. Soldiers often wrote home about cravings for familiar meals, describing in detail the simple pleasures of receiving a tin of jam, a piece of chocolate, or a small package from home. Mail deliveries were among the most important morale boosters, reminding men of their families and giving them something to hold on to during long stretches of fear and hardship. Despite brief moments of comfort, the dangers of trench life were constant. Artillery fire was the greatest threat. A single shell could bury soldiers alive, collapse trench walls, or scatter shrapnel across a wide area. Shell shock, now understood as a severe psychological trauma, affected many soldiers who endured repeated bombardments. At the time, the condition was poorly understood. Some believed it was caused by physical injury to the brain from explosions. Others thought it was a sign of weakness. In reality, the overwhelming stress of living under threat of sudden death, combined with sleep deprivation and the constant roar of shells, traumatized the mind in profound ways. Snipers were another constant danger. Soldiers learned not to expose even a fraction of their head above the parapet. Periscopes were used for observation, but these too could be targeted by enemy marksmen. A moment of carelessness could be fatal. Many sniper duels took place across no man's land, with each side waiting patiently for an opportunity. The presence of snipers influenced every action, from delivering messages to retrieving equipment left in the open. Disease also took a heavy toll. Lice infestations were nearly impossible to eradicate. Soldiers scratched constantly, and lice spread quickly through clothing and blankets. Trench fever, carried by lice, caused severe pain, high fever, and weakness, often taking men out of action for weeks. Rats thrived in the trenches, feeding on scraps and sometimes gnawing on the bodies of the dead. Their presence was both unsettling and unavoidable. Soldiers often joked grimly about the size of trench rats, describing them as nearly as large as cats. These stories, though exaggerated, reflected the uncomfortable reality that the trenches were as much home to vermin as they were to soldiers. Sanitation was crude. Toilets, known as latrines, were dug at the rear of the trench or sometimes improvised within it. Maintaining proper hygiene was a constant struggle. Clean water was limited, and mud contaminated everything. Medical personnel worked tirelessly to treat injuries and illnesses, but they too faced the challenges of operating in cramped, filthy conditions. Despite these difficulties, military medical services made significant advances during the war. The concept of triage, improved surgical techniques, and better treatment for infections saved countless lives that might otherwise have been lost. Nighttime brought a different set of dangers and responsibilities. Under cover of darkness, units repaired damaged sections of trench, transported supplies, and carried out crucial engineering tasks. Sappers and tunnelers dug beneath the enemy's lines, attempting to plant explosives that could destroy entire sections of trench. Countermining efforts sought to detect and disrupt enemy tunnels. The underground war was tense and terrifying, with miners listening intently for the faintest sound of enemy digging, aware that a miscalculation could result in catastrophic explosions. The smell of the trenches was overwhelming. It came from a mixture of mud, waste, sweat, gunpowder, and death. Soldiers often commented on how difficult it was to adjust to the odors, yet over time, most became accustomed simply because they had no choice. Beyond the physical discomfort, the emotional strain was immense. Soldiers endured long stretches of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. The feeling of vulnerability, knowing that death could come at any moment from a shell burst, sniper bullet, or gas attack, weighed heavily on the mind. Yet even in these conditions, soldiers found ways to maintain their humanity. They wrote letters, sang songs, played cards, and shared stories. Humor became a crucial survival tool. Soldiers joked about the trenches, mocking the absurdity of their situation. These moments of levity did not erase the horrors, but they did provide brief reprieves from the relentless reality of war. As 1915 progressed, both sides improved their defenses. Trench systems grew deeper and more elaborate. Reinforced dugouts offered better protection from artillery. New weapons, including more powerful machine guns and improved grenades, changed the dynamics of combat. At the same time, both sides sought ways to break the stalemate. The introduction of poison gas marked one of the most feared developments of the war. First used in large quantities by Germany at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, chlorine gas rolled across the battlefield, creating panic among Allied soldiers who had no protective equipment. Gas masks were quickly developed, but the psychological impact of gas warfare remained severe. Soldiers now faced not only the threat of bullets and shells but also the invisible danger of toxic clouds. The years ahead would bring some of the deadliest battles in history. The trenches would become the stage for massive offensives designed to wear down the enemy through attrition rather than maneuver. By 1915 and 1916, trench warfare had matured into a grim, unforgiving struggle in which neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough without paying an enormous price. The military leaders of the major powers understood that the stalemate could not continue indefinitely, yet they faced a fundamental problem. Defensive tactics had become far superior to offensive capabilities. Machine guns, barbed wire, and deep trench systems made frontal assaults incredibly costly. Artillery, though powerful, often failed to destroy enemy fortifications or barbed wire. And even when bombardments flattened a section of trench, the defenders could regroup quickly in reserve lines. Nevertheless, generals believed that massive offensives were necessary to weaken the enemy, consume their resources, and eventually force them into collapse. This belief led to some of the bloodiest battles in human history. One of the earliest attempts to break the stalemate was the Allied offensive at the Battle of Neuve Chapelle in March 1915. The British used a concentrated artillery bombardment to cut through German lines, and initially they achieved success. However, poor communication and delays in reinforcing the advance allowed German defenders to recover. The offensive stalled, providing a harsh lesson in the challenges of coordinating large-scale attacks across a devastated landscape. Later in 1915, at Loos, the British used chlorine gas in an attempt to gain an advantage. The wind shifted, blowing some of the gas back toward their own lines. Soldiers struggled to move rapidly through churned earth and tangled wire, and once again, German defenses held firm. The pattern of heavy bombardment, minor advances, and massive casualties had begun. But it was in 1916 that the horrors of trench warfare reached a scale the world had never witnessed. Early in the year, the German High Command, led by Erich von Falkenhayn, chose the French fortress city of Verdun as the target for a massive offensive. Falkenhayn's strategy was not merely to capture Verdun but to bleed the French army to exhaustion. Verdun held deep symbolic importance for France, making it unthinkable for the French to give it up. By choosing such a location, the Germans ensured that France would commit enormous forces to its defense. The Battle of Verdun began on February 21, 1916, with one of the most intense artillery bombardments ever recorded. Over 1 million shells fell in the opening phase alone. The surrounding landscape, once covered in forests and small villages, was transformed into a wasteland of shattered trees, cratered earth, and smoking ruins. French soldiers rushed to defend the forts around Verdun, including the crucial Fort Douaumont, which fell to German forces early in the battle. The French, under the leadership of General Philippe Pétain, fought tenaciously to hold the line. Pétain's famous order, "They shall not pass," reflected the determination of the French army and became a rallying cry for the entire nation. Verdun turned into a prolonged struggle of attrition, with both sides suffering catastrophic casualties. French counterattacks slowly pushed the Germans back, but at an enormous cost. By the time the battle ended in December 1916, French casualties had reached around 377,000, while German losses were nearly 337,000. Though exact numbers vary among sources, the scale of suffering is undisputed. Verdun became a symbol of the futility and horror of trench warfare, a place where entire divisions were ground down in a battle that changed little of the overall front line. While the French fought desperately at Verdun, the British launched their own massive offensive along the River Somme in July 1916. The Battle of the Somme has become one of the most infamous engagements in world history, not only because of its scale but because of the staggering losses suffered on its first day. In preparation for the attack, the British conducted a week-long artillery bombardment intended to destroy German defenses and cut barbed wire. Many commanders believed this bombardment would allow their infantry to advance with minimal resistance. However, German defenses were far stronger than anticipated. Their deep dugouts protected soldiers from the bombardment, and much of the barbed wire remained intact. At 7:30 in the morning on July 1, 1916, British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and advanced across no man's land in long lines. Almost immediately, German machine guns opened fire. The result was devastating. By nightfall, the British Army had suffered approximately 57,000 casualties, including about 19,000 killed. It was the bloodiest single day in British military history. Yet the battle continued for months, with limited gains measured in yards. The Somme offensive eventually ended in November 1916, with total Allied casualties surpassing 620,000 and German casualties estimated at around 465,000. Despite these enormous losses, the front lines had barely moved. The Somme and Verdun demonstrated the deadly combination of outdated offensive tactics and modern defensive technologies. Commanders on both sides struggled to adapt. The sheer scale of casualties forced armies to reconsider their strategies, leading to improvements in artillery coordination, the development of specialized assault units, and innovations such as tanks. But before these changes took full effect, millions more soldiers would face the dangers of trench warfare. While the Western Front witnessed battles of immense scale, trench warfare was not unique to Europe. The Eastern Front, stretching across territories between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, also saw entrenched positions, though the greater space and mobility of the landscape prevented the same kind of prolonged stalemate. In the Middle East, during the Gallipoli campaign of 1915 to 1916, Allied forces encountered trenches defending the Ottoman coast. There too, soldiers endured the hardships of static warfare, extreme heat, disease, and relentless fire from well-protected defenders. Gallipoli became another tragic example of how trench warfare favored armies fighting on home terrain with strong defensive positions. Back in France, the experience of soldiers on all sides shared many similarities. In 1916 and 1917, the grinding nature of the war began to take a toll on morale. Soldiers who had once marched enthusiastically into battle now struggled with the psychological burden of prolonged combat. The constant presence of death, the lack of meaningful progress, and the conditions of trench life created deep emotional scars. Desertions, instances of mutiny, and widespread disillusionment emerged as armies pushed their men to the limits of endurance. In 1917, the French army suffered a series of mutinies following failed offensives, most notably the disastrous Nivelle offensive in April of that year. Promised a decisive breakthrough, French soldiers instead faced massive casualties with little gain. Worn down by years of fighting, they refused to participate in further suicidal attacks. General Pétain restored discipline by improving conditions, rotating troops more frequently, and avoiding unnecessary offensives. But the mutinies underscored the human limits of trench warfare and the urgent need for new strategies. Britain and the German Empire experienced their own crises of morale. Germany faced increasing shortages of food and supplies due to the Allied naval blockade. Soldiers at the front noticed the decline in quality and quantity of rations, intensifying frustration and hopelessness. Britain, preparing for new offensives, confronted the challenge of training large numbers of conscripted soldiers to fight in extremely difficult conditions. The introduction of conscription in 1916 marked a recognition that voluntary enlistment could no longer sustain the war effort. Still, despite these hardships, armies continued fighting, adapting their tactics and developing new technology. Light machine guns, improved artillery methods such as the creeping barrage, and more effective coordination between infantry and supporting units began to shift the balance. At the Battle of Vimy Ridge in April 1917, Canadian forces demonstrated the effectiveness of careful planning, precise artillery support, and rigorous training. They captured a heavily fortified position with fewer casualties than previous attempts, though still at a heavy cost. Vimy Ridge showed that the stalemate of trench warfare could be challenged, but only with innovative thinking and meticulous execution. Nevertheless, trench warfare persisted through 1917, with battles such as Passchendaele revealing once again the horrific conditions soldiers faced. The Third Battle of Ypres, commonly known as Passchendaele, became notorious for the mud that swallowed men, horses, and equipment. Weeks of rain turned the battlefield into a swamp, making movement nearly impossible. Soldiers struggled to advance under constant shellfire, sinking into mud so deep that some drowned. Artillery shells disappeared into the mire without exploding. Despite enormous effort and sacrifice, the Allied advance at Passchendaele gained only a few miles. As 1917 drew to a close, both sides were exhausted. Millions had been killed or wounded, economies were strained, and political tensions were rising. Yet the war carried on, shaped by the same entrenched positions that had defined it since late 1914. The next year would bring dramatic changes, including the entry of the United States into the war and Germany's final desperate attempt to break the stalemate. But before those events unfolded, soldiers continued to live and die in the trenches, facing dangers that had become part of their everyday existence. To understand trench warfare fully, we must examine the weapons and technologies that created and sustained the stalemate. The First World War was the first great conflict of the industrial age, and its battlefields became laboratories where new methods of killing were tested and refined. Traditional military thinking had not yet adapted to the transforming power of these technologies, and the mismatch between old tactics and new weaponry amplified the scale of destruction. At the heart of trench warfare stood the machine gun. Before the war, many officers underestimated its significance, believing it would be too heavy, unreliable, or prone to overheating to dominate battlefields. They assumed infantry attacks could still rely on speed, discipline, and courage. But the reality was starkly different. Machine guns like the German MG-08 and the British Vickers gun were capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute with remarkable reliability. Positioned in sheltered emplacements behind barbed wire, machine gunners could sweep no man's land with deadly efficiency. Rows of advancing soldiers, no matter how brave, stood little chance against such concentrated firepower. The machine gun transformed the offensive battlefield into a death trap, forcing armies to dig deeper and find ways to protect themselves from its relentless fire. Artillery, however, remained the primary killer in the trenches. Rough estimates suggest that the vast majority of casualties on the Western Front resulted from shells rather than bullets. Industrial production allowed armies to manufacture millions of shells, and artillery pieces grew larger, more accurate, and more destructive throughout the war. Heavy guns could launch shells weighing hundreds of pounds over great distances, capable of flattening trench lines, destroying buildings, and leaving landscapes so scarred that they were barely recognizable. Lighter field guns provided rapid, mobile fire during attacks or defensive operations. Artillery became a science that required careful calculation of distance, wind, elevation, and timing. Observers used periscopes, aircraft, and later balloons to identify enemy positions and correct firing errors. Barrages could be continuous, lasting hours or even days, as at the Somme and Verdun, where bombardments attempted to obliterate enemy defenses before infantry advanced. But artillery had limitations. Shells often failed to cut barbed wire, creating deadly obstacles for advancing troops. The constant bombardment devastated the terrain, making movement difficult and sometimes impossible. And artillery fire frequently warned defenders of an impending attack, giving them time to prepare. The creeping barrage emerged as a solution to some of these problems. Invented and refined during the war, it involved artillery firing just ahead of advancing infantry in a moving curtain of fire. As the barrage progressed forward at a calculated pace, soldiers followed closely behind, using the explosions as cover to approach enemy lines before defenders could recover. This technique required precise coordination and training, but when executed well, it significantly improved the chances of breaking through trench defenses. It became a hallmark of later Allied offensives, contributing to successes at battles like Vimy Ridge in 1917. Beyond machine guns and artillery, other weapons shaped trench warfare in distinct ways. Hand grenades, often called bombs at the time, became indispensable tools for close combat in trenches. The confined spaces of dugouts, traverses, and firing bays made grenades particularly effective. Germany began the war with a well-developed grenade program, including the iconic stick grenade known as the potato masher. Britain and France quickly expanded their own production. Specialized units, sometimes called grenade or bombing squads, trained to clear trenches using grenades and close-quarters combat. These squads became essential for raids and local offensives. The bayonet remained a symbolic weapon of the infantry soldier, but its practical use was limited. While close combat certainly occurred, especially during trench raids or night encounters, the vast majority of fighting happened at range. Still, soldiers trained extensively with bayonets, and military culture continued to emphasize its importance as a test of discipline and courage. In reality, the bayonet was used far less frequently than rifles, grenades, or simply the butt of a weapon in the chaotic moments of hand-to-hand combat. Perhaps the most feared weapon of the war was poison gas. First used on a large scale by Germany at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, chlorine gas drifted across the battlefield, causing soldiers to choke and their lungs to burn. The psychological impact was enormous. Soldiers had no experience with chemical weapons and no protective equipment at first. Panic spread quickly as greenish-yellow clouds rolled toward trenches. As the war continued, both sides developed new gases, including phosgene, which was more deadly, and mustard gas, which caused severe blistering of the skin and lungs. Mustard gas lingered on surfaces for days, contaminating trenches, equipment, and clothing. Gas masks improved over time, but no protective measure was perfect. Even the fear of gas attacks kept soldiers in constant tension, knowing that a seemingly calm day could suddenly turn deadly. Flamethrowers were another terrifying innovation. First introduced by Germany in 1915, flamethrowers projected streams of burning fuel toward enemy trenches. Though their range was limited and operators were highly vulnerable, the psychological impact was disproportionate to the tactical value. The sight of flames sweeping across the ground and the overwhelming heat created panic among defenders. Flamethrowers were used sparingly due to their risks, but they symbolized the increasingly brutal nature of the war. As the stalemate persisted, both sides realized that new technology was needed to restore mobility to the battlefield. The British introduced tanks in 1916 during the Battle of the Somme. These early tanks were slow, mechanically unreliable, and often broke down before reaching the front line. But when they functioned as intended, they demonstrated the potential to cross trenches, crush barbed wire, and provide moving cover for infantry. The first use of tanks did not break the stalemate, but it marked a turning point in military history. Improved tanks appeared in later battles, particularly in 1917 and 1918, contributing to Allied advances and signaling the beginning of a new era in warfare. Communication technology also evolved. Field telephones, signal flares, runners, carrier pigeons, and even early wireless radios played roles in coordinating operations. None were foolproof. Telephone lines were easily cut by shellfire, leaving units isolated. Runners carrying messages risked being killed in no man's land. Pigeons were reliable in many cases, but not invulnerable to weather or gunfire. Commanders often faced enormous challenges maintaining control over battles once the fighting began. Medical advancements developed rapidly in response to the unprecedented scale of injuries. Field ambulances, triage stations, and casualty clearing stations formed networks that moved wounded soldiers from the front to safer treatment areas. Advances in antiseptics, blood transfusions, and surgical techniques saved many who would have died in earlier conflicts. The war forced militaries to rethink medical logistics, creating systems that influenced modern emergency medicine. Amid these technological developments, the daily existence of soldiers remained defined by the harsh realities of trench life. Even when not engaged in major battles, soldiers faced constant danger. Artillery shells could strike at any time. Snipers watched patiently for a target. Raids launched at night kept both sides on edge. The threat of gas attacks meant soldiers often slept with gas masks close at hand. Fatigue was constant. Sleep came in brief, interrupted moments. Soldiers' memories frequently focused on exhaustion as much as fear. Yet the trenches also developed an unexpected sense of routine. Soldiers cleaned their weapons, repaired sandbags, drained water from dugouts, and maintained barbed wire defenses. They wrote letters, read newspapers when available, and sometimes received visits from chaplains or entertainers. Occasional moments of calm were treasured. Some soldiers recorded the birdsong that still drifted over the battlefield in early mornings. Others described sunsets glowing over the ruined landscape, moments of beauty in a world dominated by destruction. These small fragments of normality helped men endure mentally. But the longer the war continued, the more the human spirit was tested. Many soldiers struggled with what would later be recognized as psychological trauma. The term shell shock entered the military vocabulary, though its causes and treatments were poorly understood at the time. Some soldiers developed uncontrollable shaking, nightmares, paralysis, or emotional numbness. Others were unable to speak or struggled to follow orders. Because medical understanding was limited, shell shock was often treated as a disciplinary problem rather than a medical condition. Men suffering from severe trauma were occasionally punished or even executed if their behavior was interpreted as cowardice or desertion. These tragic cases reflected the pressures of a war that stretched human endurance beyond known limits. As the war moved into its later years, the armies that fought in the trenches changed in composition. Veterans with years of experience were gradually replaced by new recruits who learned quickly or died quickly. The expertise of seasoned soldiers was invaluable, but casualties eroded this knowledge. Training programs struggled to keep pace with battlefield realities. Young men arrived at the front hoping to prove themselves, only to discover a world of mud, danger, and despair. Their letters home often described a sense of disbelief, as though the trenches were too terrible to be real. By late 1917, innovations in tactics and equipment had begun to shift the balance. Specialized stormtrooper units in the German army developed infiltration tactics that bypassed strongpoints, attacking weaker positions first to disrupt the enemy line. The Allies, influenced by lessons from earlier failures, refined their artillery coordination, infantry tactics, and use of tanks. The war was gradually moving away from static trench conditions toward more mobile operations. Yet the fundamental experience of soldiers remained deeply tied to the trenches that scarred the Western Front. As 1918 approached, both sides faced extreme exhaustion. Germany, dealing with internal unrest and resource shortages, planned one final massive offensive to break the stalemate before American forces could fully arrive. The Allies prepared to withstand this assault while building toward their own counteroffensives. The next phase of the war would be decisive, but it would still bear the imprint of the trenches where millions had already sacrificed their lives. By early 1918, the First World War had reached a critical turning point. After years of trench stalemate, exhaustion spread across all armies. Millions were dead, millions more wounded, and even those who remained at the front understood that they were part of a conflict rapidly consuming the strength of nations. Yet despite the shared suffering, neither side was willing to accept defeat. Germany, in particular, believed that one final, decisive push might break the Allied lines before American soldiers could arrive in overwhelming numbers. The stakes could not have been higher. The outcome of 1918 would determine not only the fate of the front line but the future of Europe. The Russian withdrawal from the war following the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 allowed Germany to transfer divisions from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. This bolstered their numbers temporarily, giving German commanders the belief that a major offensive could finally deliver victory. General Erich Ludendorff became the driving force behind the plan. He envisioned a series of rapid, powerful attacks that would smash through Allied trenches before they could organize a coordinated defense. The offensive would rely heavily on infiltration tactics developed by specially trained stormtrooper units. These stormtroopers would bypass strong points, penetrate deep into enemy positions, and disrupt communication lines, creating chaos that conventional forces could exploit. On March 21, 1918, the German Spring Offensive, known as the Kaiserschlacht or Kaiser's Battle, began with a massive artillery bombardment. Unlike earlier bombardments that aimed to pulverize enemy trenches, this one focused on high explosive and gas shells intended to disorient and disable defenders rather than destroy the ground entirely. When the infantry advanced, they achieved dramatic gains. Stormtroopers moved swiftly through gaps in the British Fifth Army's lines, forcing a retreat and capturing significant territory. For the first time since 1914, the front began to shift rapidly. Allied soldiers, accustomed to static warfare, now faced the shock of open, mobile combat. Over the following weeks, Germany launched several additional offensives, each seeking to exploit breakthroughs and push toward critical strategic points, such as the channel ports and the supply hubs that sustained the British Expeditionary Force. The offensives achieved remarkable initial successes, advancing more than the Allies had gained in years of fighting. German troops reached within artillery range of Paris, prompting French civilians to flee and raising fears that the capital might fall. Yet these gains came at a tremendous cost. Germany lacked the reserves and logistical capacity to sustain such rapid advances. Stormtrooper units suffered heavy casualties. Supplies struggled to keep pace with moving front lines. Soldiers pushed forward into terrain that had been devastated by earlier battles, making movement and organization difficult. Moreover, the offensives lacked a clear, unified strategic objective. Instead of concentrating on one decisive breakthrough, Ludendorff launched multiple operations in different sectors, dispersing Germany's limited resources. As the German advance slowed, Allied forces regrouped. The arrival of American troops played a crucial role. Though still inexperienced in trench warfare, the Americans brought fresh manpower and energy. Under the unified command of French General Ferdinand Foch, Allied coordination improved dramatically. For the first time in the war, Allied armies operated with a single strategic vision, optimizing their combined strength. By July 1918, the German offensives had lost momentum. Exhausted and increasingly demoralized, German units struggled to hold their positions. The Allies seized the opportunity to launch a counteroffensive at the Second Battle of the Marne. American, French, and British forces attacked with improved artillery coordination, supported by tanks and aircraft. Their success marked the beginning of a sustained Allied push that would continue relentlessly through the rest of the year. The 100 Days Offensive, beginning in August 1918, was the final chapter in trench warfare. At its opening phase, the Battle of Amiens demonstrated how far Allied tactics had evolved. Tanks advanced in large numbers, supported by coordinated infantry and artillery. The attack achieved surprise, inflicted heavy casualties on German defenders, and forced a withdrawal. Ludendorff later described August 8, 1918, the first day of the battle, as the Black Day of the German army, recognizing that German forces no longer possessed the strength to turn the tide. From Amiens onward, the Allies launched a series of offensives across the Western Front, pushing the Germans steadily eastward. The nature of warfare changed dramatically. Instead of static trench lines, the front became fluid, with units advancing rapidly, capturing territory, and outflanking German defensive positions. The trenches that had defined the war since late 1914 were gradually abandoned, overrun, or bypassed. Mobility, long absent from the Western Front, returned as the dominant feature of the battlefield. Germany's situation deteriorated quickly. Food shortages, labor strikes, and growing political unrest undermined the war effort. Many soldiers, disillusioned after years of hardship, surrendered rather than continue fighting. The Allied naval blockade continued to starve Germany of essential supplies. As Allied armies advanced, German commanders realized the end was approaching. The collapse of trench warfare was not merely a military event but the result of a profound shift in the war's psychology, technology, and manpower. By late 1918, the German High Command informed the Kaiser that victory was impossible. After years of insisting on total victory, Germany now faced total defeat unless an armistice could be negotiated quickly. The German government, now pressured by revolutionaries and moderates alike, opened talks with the Allies. On November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the guns fell silent. The First World War ended with an armistice that halted the fighting, though the final peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, would not be signed until the following year. As soldiers emerged from the trenches for the last time, they walked through landscapes that bore the scars of unimaginable violence. Entire regions of France and Belgium were reduced to rubble and craters. Forests were flattened. Villages had vanished. Millions of men had been killed or wounded. Survivors carried emotional and physical scars that would remain with them long after the war was over. Trench warfare left a legacy that shaped military thinking for decades. The experience revealed the devastating impact of industrial weaponry on traditional tactics, forcing armies to rethink the way wars were fought. It demonstrated the limits of endurance and exposed the deep human cost of attritional warfare. It also altered societies profoundly. Nations mourned the loss of a generation. Families struggled to understand the sacrifices made in muddy trenches far from home. Memorials and cemeteries spread across Europe, marking fields where so many had fallen. But as profound as the end of the war was, understanding trench warfare requires more than recounting battles and strategies. We must return to the experience of the soldiers themselves, for it was they who lived the reality of the trenches every day. Their photographs, diaries, letters, and testimonies offer a window into a world that defies imagination. To fully grasp the nature of trench warfare, we must consider the psychological, emotional, and physical conditions these men endured in both triumph and terror. The trenches were not only a military environment but a social world shaped by necessity. Soldiers formed strong bonds with the men beside them, forged through shared danger, discomfort, and hope. They developed their own slang, humor, and coping mechanisms. They celebrated moments of camaraderie, even in the darkest hours. Soldiers from different backgrounds, classes, and regions found themselves united by the simple desire to survive another day. These bonds formed a crucial foundation for the morale of armies. Without them, no force could have endured the grinding demands of trench warfare. Another essential aspect of soldier experience was the constant interaction with death. Trench warfare placed soldiers in close proximity to the fallen, often without the opportunity to bury them properly. Bodies lay in no man's land, exposed to the elements and impossible to retrieve under fire. Sometimes they lay partially buried in collapsed trench sections. These grim reminders were inescapable, shaping the emotional landscape of the front. Soldiers wrote about becoming numb to sights that would once have horrified them, an adaptation necessary for survival but one that came at great psychological cost. Yet life in the trenches was not defined solely by suffering. There were moments of companionship and even creativity. Soldiers carved dugout furniture, constructed makeshift theaters, and played improvised games. Some wrote poetry, capturing the beauty of a sunrise or the sadness of a lost friend. Others documented their surroundings in sketches, revealing an eye for detail that preserved the reality of trench life in ways photographs could not. These expressions of humanity stood in stark contrast to the violence that surrounded them. In quieter periods between battles, soldiers repaired trenches, tended to personal hygiene as best they could, and discussed news from home. They learned to identify the sound of different artillery shells, recognizing which posed immediate danger and which could be ignored. They understood the rhythm of the front, when to expect gas attacks, when enemy artillery tended to fire, and when patrols were likely. Though danger remained constant, familiarity gave soldiers a strange sense of routine. The extraordinary became ordinary because it had to. Trench warfare also created a unique relationship between soldiers and officers. Leadership played an essential role in maintaining order and morale. Officers who shared hardships with their men earned respect. Those who remained distant or failed to understand the realities of trench life faced resentment. Many officers, particularly junior ones, suffered high casualty rates because they were expected to lead from the front during attacks. As we consider the final phase of trench warfare, it becomes clear that the system did not collapse simply because armies developed better tactics or new technologies. It collapsed because the human toll reached a breaking point, and because the broader strategic picture shifted decisively against Germany. The Allied armies, reinforced by American troops, possessed superior resources, coordination, and morale by 1918. Germany, stretched to its limit, could not match them. When the war finally ended, soldiers left the trenches behind, but the impact of their experience remained embedded in the collective memory of nations. The Great War was expected to be the war that ended all wars, a conflict so devastating that no country would ever allow such a tragedy to unfold again. Yet the peace that followed proved fragile. The unresolved tensions, political upheaval, and economic hardship created by the war set the stage for future conflicts. The trenches, however, remained silent witnesses to the past. Many were filled in or eroded by time, but some preserved sections still exist today as memorials. Walking through them reveals their narrow confines, their damp floors, and the claustrophobic environment that millions of men once called home. These preserved trenches offer modern visitors a faint sense of the world soldiers inhabited, though nothing can fully convey the terror, exhaustion, and resilience that define trench warfare. The story of trench warfare is not only the story of a military strategy but the story of human endurance. It is the story of young men who faced conditions harsher than anything they could have imagined, of families who waited anxiously for news, and of nations grappling with the consequences of industrialized war. It is a reminder of the extraordinary capacity for both destruction and courage that lies within humanity. When the guns finally fell silent on November 11, 1918, the world faced a landscape transformed by 4 years of unrelenting trench warfare. The armistice brought an end to the fighting, but the consequences of the conflict continued to ripple across continents, shaping societies, politics, and military strategy for generations. Millions of soldiers returned home, carrying with them memories of the trenches that would affect their lives in profound ways. Nations struggled to rebuild shattered economies and landscapes. And the world sought to understand how such a devastating war had come to pass, hoping to prevent anything like it from happening again. For the soldiers who survived, the transition from life in the trenches to civilian existence was often difficult and disorienting. Many had spent years in a world governed by danger, routine, and intense camaraderie. The trenches had become part of their identity, shaping their behavior and their thoughts. Returning home meant stepping into a life that had continued without them, sometimes changing dramatically in their absence. Families greeted loved ones with joy, yet beneath the surface lay a gulf of unspoken trauma. Many veterans struggled to explain their experiences, knowing that no description could fully capture the terror, monotony, and emotional strain of trench life. Physical injuries were widespread. Survivors carried scars from shrapnel, bullet wounds, and gas exposure. Amputations were common. Many soldiers suffered from chronic respiratory problems and lingering effects of chemical weapons. Eyesight damage, hearing impairment, and bone fractures were lasting reminders of the brutal conditions in the trenches. As medical advancements saved more lives, they also created a new generation of wounded veterans who required ongoing care. Hospitals and rehabilitation centers worked tirelessly to support these men, but the scale of need often overwhelmed resources. Equally significant were the psychological wounds. What was once called shell shock is now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Soldiers who had endured constant bombardment, witnessed the deaths of their friends, or survived terrifying assaults often returned home with deep emotional scars. Some experienced nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, or depression. Others displayed symptoms that families and communities struggled to understand. At the time, psychological trauma was poorly defined, and many veterans received little or no treatment. Some hid their struggles in silence, attempting to reintegrate into society without acknowledging the turmoil within. Others found it impossible to resume normal life, facing unemployment, social isolation, and emotional breakdowns. The war left an entire generation grappling with invisible wounds. Women also faced significant challenges in the post-war years. During the conflict, they had taken on roles traditionally occupied by men, working in factories, serving as nurses, and supporting the war effort in countless ways. When soldiers returned home, women were expected to step aside from these positions, but many found that their experiences had changed them permanently. The war altered social dynamics and accelerated calls for women's rights in several countries. In Britain, for example, partial women's suffrage was granted in 1918, influenced in part by the essential contributions women had made during the war. The physical landscape of the Western Front bore the marks of destruction for decades. Vast regions of France and Belgium were so heavily damaged that they were declared uninhabitable in the immediate aftermath. This zone, known as the Red Zone in France, contained areas contaminated by unexploded munitions, chemical residues, and deep craters. Entire villages had been wiped from the map. Forests had been reduced to splintered stumps. Farmland was devastated beyond recognition. Rebuilding these areas required immense time and resources. Some remained unsafe or unusable long after the war, and even today, farmers occasionally uncover remnants of unexploded shells during plowing, a stark reminder of the war that once raged across their land. The human cost of the war was nearly incomprehensible. Estimates vary, but roughly 10 million soldiers died, and more than 20 million were wounded. Civilian casualties, caused by famine, disease, and military operations, added millions more to the toll. In towns and villages across Europe, memorials were erected to honor the dead. Names of fallen soldiers were engraved on monuments, plaques, and gravestones. Families regularly visited cemeteries maintained by organizations such as the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, which created thousands of carefully preserved burial sites across former battlefields. These cemeteries became places of mourning, reflection, and remembrance for generations. Despite hopes that the Great War would prevent future conflicts, the peace that followed proved fragile. The Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh terms on Germany, contributing to economic hardship, political instability, and resentment that would ultimately fuel the rise of extremist movements. Many historians argue that the unresolved tensions and punitive measures of the treaty played a significant role in setting the stage for the Second World War. The tragedy of trench warfare, rather than ending conflict for good, became part of a larger cycle of upheaval that shaped the 20th century. Yet the legacy of trench warfare extends far beyond political consequences. It profoundly influenced military strategy. The limitations of trench offensives, the dominance of machine guns and artillery, and the need for improved coordination led to significant changes in how armies planned and executed operations. The development of combined arms tactics, integrating infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft, directly emerged from lessons learned in the trenches. These innovations laid the groundwork for modern military doctrine, which emphasizes mobility, communication, and flexibility rather than static defensive lines. Culturally, trench warfare reshaped art, literature, and public consciousness. Writers such as Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, and Eric Maria Remarque captured the emotional truth of the war with haunting clarity. Their poems and novels revealed the contrast between patriotic idealism and the brutal reality of the trenches. Owen's line, "The old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori," became one of the most famous condemnations of glorified notions of war. Remarque's "All Quiet on the Western Front" offered a German perspective that echoed the shared suffering of soldiers on all sides. These works shaped public understanding of the war, ensuring that the human experience remained at the center of its legacy. Trench art, created by soldiers using shell casings, bullets, and other battlefield materials, also became a powerful form of expression. These objects, carved or crafted during quiet moments, symbolized attempts to reclaim a sense of humanity amid destruction. Many pieces were brought home as mementos, linking families to the experiences of loved ones. Today, museums preserve these artifacts as reminders of the creativity and resilience that emerged in even the harshest conditions. Commemoration became an essential part of national identity for many countries. Armistice Day ceremonies honored the moment when the war ended, with 2 minutes of silence observed at 11 a.m. on November 11. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, established in several countries, symbolized the countless lives lost without identification or recognition. These traditions continue today, reflecting the enduring impact of the war on collective memory. In the decades following the war, scholars and military historians studied trench warfare extensively, seeking to understand its causes and lessons. They analyzed the failures of command, the limitations of technology, and the human factors that shaped the conflict. These studies contributed to a more nuanced understanding of industrial warfare and the importance of adaptability. The war revealed the dangers of rigid thinking, the consequences of underestimating technological change, and the necessity of preparing armies for the realities of modern combat. Trench warfare also influenced international diplomacy. In the years after the war, nations sought ways to prevent similar conflicts. Organizations such as the League of Nations emerged from these efforts, though their effectiveness was limited. The devastation of the First World War remained a powerful motivator for diplomatic cooperation, even as political conflicts continued to threaten peace. On the ground, the trenches themselves, once symbols of death and suffering, became historical sites. Preserved sections at places like Vimy Ridge, Beaumont Hamel, and the Ypres salient allow visitors to walk through reconstructed trench lines, experiencing their narrow dimensions and oppressive atmosphere. These sites serve as educational tools and memorials, ensuring that the realities of trench warfare are not forgotten. Standing in a preserved trench, surrounded by silent earth and distant fields, offers a moment of reflection on the millions who once stood in the same place facing fear, hardship, and uncertainty. Over time, the story of trench warfare became an essential chapter in our understanding of human conflict. It stands as a testament to the adaptability of soldiers, the resilience of the human spirit, and the immense cost of industrialized war. It reminds us that courage and suffering often exist side by side, and that the true measure of war lies not in territorial gains or strategic victories, but in the experiences of those who lived through it. The First World War marked a turning point in global history. Its trenches carved deep into the earth and deeper still into the memories of nations. The war changed borders, toppled empires, and reshaped international relations. It accelerated technological advancement, transformed societies, and redefined the meaning of sacrifice. The trenches, with their mud, wire, and relentless danger, became the physical embodiment of a conflict that challenged the meaning of humanity itself. As we reflect on trench warfare, we recognize that it was not merely a military tactic but a human ordeal of immense magnitude. It demonstrated the extremes to which nations would go to achieve victory, and the extraordinary endurance required of the men who fought. The lessons of trench warfare remain relevant today, reminding us of the need for diplomacy, the importance of restraint, and the heavy price of war. When the last soldiers finally left the trenches behind in 1918, they stepped out of a world that few who had not lived through it could fully comprehend. Yet their experiences, preserved in history, testimony, and memory, continue to speak to us. They remind us to look critically at the causes of conflict, to honor the lives lost, and to strive for a future in which the horrors of trench warfare remain a warning from the past rather than a prophecy for the future. As the decades passed, the scars of the First World War slowly faded from the landscapes of Europe, but the memory of trench warfare remained etched far more deeply in the consciousness of humanity. The trenches, once crowded with fear, discipline, and unbroken resolve, became silent reminders of a conflict that reshaped the modern world. In their mud and darkness, millions of ordinary men endured extraordinary hardship, confronting the limits of human endurance while navigating a world torn apart by industrialized violence. Looking back, the trenches reveal more than a military strategy or a phase of conflict. They reveal the fragility of peace, the devastating consequences of unchecked ambition, and the heavy price paid when diplomacy fails. They remind us that the soldiers who lived and died in those narrow earthen walls were not symbols of nations but individuals whose hopes, dreams, and futures were consumed by the demands of a global war. Their sacrifice reshaped societies, influenced political destinies, and forever altered the course of history. Today, preserved trench lines and quiet war cemeteries stand in their place, inviting reflection on what was lost and what was learned. Visitors walk where soldiers once crouched under fire, and they see the world from the same cramped perspective. The silence of these places speaks louder than any battlefield noise, carrying a message across generations. It urges us to remember the cost of conflict and the responsibility we share in preventing such devastation from returning. Trench warfare was a chapter marked by suffering, endurance, and profound transformation. Its legacy continues to shape how nations prepare for war, how societies honor sacrifice, and how individuals understand the human capacity for both destruction and resilience. And as long as the lessons of the trenches are remembered, they remain a powerful reminder of what the world must strive to avoid, and of the peace that must always be guarded with vigilance and understanding.